Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zupko. Today, we're going to speak about the European Union foreign policy. Many times when we speak about the European Union foreign policy, we are struggling to define it. Is it based in realist tradition? Is it based in neoliberal tradition, liberal tradition? Are there constructivist elements in the policy? So it's a mixture because there are 27 states in the European Union. And I think it's quite nice to have someone who can clarify how we should approach the European Union foreign policy and European Union external action service. And that's basically the task for today. My guest today is Professor Knud Erik Jørgensen. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Professor Jørgensen is an emeritus professor in international relations at the Department of Political Science, Aarhus University in Denmark. His research focuses on European foreign policy and international relations theory. Some of his recent research is on the European External Action Service, which is quite useful for today's episode. And he also deals with diplomacy, with the realities of international relation theories in foreign policy, and the traditions of international relations theories. So my first question for the professor is, when we're discussing, for instance, US foreign policy, they always, try to deal with realist tradition, with neorealism. But when we discuss the European Union foreign policy, it's quite complex. So which international relation theory underpins it? And is it even possible to answer that questions when we have the complexity of the European Union?
Well, as you promised, the topic that we are going to talk about today is complex. So I'll do my best to simplify things. And one way that works, at least for me, in terms of simplify things, is to make a very sort of a hard distinction between, on the one hand, foreign policy, those people who make foreign policy, and those who implement it, like diplomats. And on the other hand, us scholars who try to understand what the diplomats and the politicians are doing when they are pursuing foreign policy objectives. And those two groups employ very different languages. They sort of pursue different discourses. And in order not to complicate things too much, it actually is a big advantage to keep those discourses or concepts separate. So when I talk about foreign policy, we can talk about the characteristics of any foreign policy in the world, and we can put different labels on it. But some of the labels I would not put on foreign policy is realist, liberal, constructivist, because those terms belong to the scholarly side of the equation. That is terms that we scholars, at least when we have an interest in theorizing, tend to use. Yes, when scholars debate US foreign policy, from time to time, the concepts of realism and neorealism pop up, but also does liberal approaches or liberal understandings, liberal objectives, and that kind of stuff. So basically, the discussion about US foreign policy is an encounter between, on the one hand, some people who believe that the foreign policy is realist and other people who think it's liberal. When it comes to EU foreign policy, it's not the same because there is not a tradition in Europe, at least there's not the same long tradition in Europe in terms of discussing EU foreign policy. To many people, it simply doesn't exist. And of course, that is an approach that I cannot possibly share, because if it doesn't exist, then I've wasted the last 30 years of my life on studying something that doesn't exist. So how can I possibly accept such a view? And yes, I cannot. Then you ask which kind of theory underpins it. And here is maybe sort of a problem with that formulation, because I don't think that any theory underpins any foreign policy. To employ a theory is trying to understand the dynamics of a given foreign policy. So it's on the scholarly side, it's something that we do when we try to analyze, when we study foreign policy, and when we teach the topic to students. My main point is that Yes, we can characterize foreign policy, whether it's American or it's European or Chinese or Russian for that matter, and we can choose some words we think is suitable for characterizing a given foreign policy. For example, to give an example, I don't know of any realist foreign policy. What would such a foreign policy be like? We know, for example, that E.H. Carr, one of the sort of the intellectual godfather of the realist tradition, he recommended appeasement during the late 1930s. So is appeasement policy realist foreign policy? We also know that Professors Mearsheimer and Stephen Wald recommended the US not to intervene in Iraq. Is non-intervention realist foreign policy? That is maybe difficult argument to sort of make in a compelling fashion. So there are some really serious problems in using a theoretical language to characterize a foreign policy.
That's very insightful because, it also depends, how people are using those labels. Because as we know, the politicians, or for instance, the European Union politicians even, they try to separate themselves from others. But when you go deeper and you, for instance, do discourse analysis of the policy or the implementation of some legal text, that sort of policy is not there. But for instance, one of the concepts of the European Union is multilateralism. European Union is always, we want the multilateral sessions with others in terms of foreign policy. So can we speak about the IR theory and multilateralism in the European Union? Can you see any leading tradition?
When we try to understand the EU's approach to multilateralism, there are a number of promising approaches that we can consider. And then basically it's up to your own temperament, which one you find most compelling. But let me give a few examples. You can take your point of departure in those politicians who, when they gave reasons for the EU's support of multilateralism, say that, well, that is something we have to do because we are multilateral in our foundation ourselves. So basically, it's just a projection of the self into the world. And that is how they give reasons. But then, of course, we understand as scholars, we understand that when politicians give reasons, it is not the same as causes. And we scholars tend to really have an interest in causes. What is the cause of this or that? What is the cause of the First World War? But when reasons, you can also say, is how they try to legitimize what they do and explain why they don't do anything when they don't do anything. So it's reasons for action or inaction that they give. You can also say that there is quite some interesting research showing that when states engage with multilateral institutions, they tend to have a preference for projecting institutions that they know very well, because that's the domestic institution in a given country. And that given country is usually the United States, because the United States has been the designer of a whole range of different multilateral institutions. So the argument is that because the US is composed domestically as it is, with balance of powers and checks and balances and all that stuff, they prefer multilateral institutions to be the same. That is also a typical explanation why, for example, Japanese or Chinese attempts at multilateral institutions do not really succeed that often, because those sponsor or the designer of a multilateral institution with Japanese or Chinese characteristics tend to say, can we trust this? And typically they cannot. So they don't support, they don't join such initiatives. So that's the domestic institutions and the linkage towards international institutions. Then there is maybe a third reason or a factor that we could take into consideration, and that is trade. The EU is known to be a sort of a world-class trader. Europe trades with almost the entire world. And in order to have flat trade managed, it makes sense to have multilateral institutions to monitor and to sort of provide information about what is going on between country X and Y. And that's a very complex setting. So that is delegated to multilateral institutions like the WTO, the World Trade Organization. You can also say that the European Union is a union of states, and those states, at least it used to be the case, that those states are democracies. So there's something about the logic that you find in the democratic peace theory, that democracies tend to project liberal values internationally. And that is something that also can help explain why and how the EU sponsors multilateral institutions. Not only in words, it's also often the case that the European Union complements the sort of moral support of multilateral institutions with quite considerable checks. For example, I've read that the UN Department for Peacekeeping Operations would have really serious difficulties functioning as it does without the contributions from Europe. And the same goes for example, the institution that is handling all these very serious problems with chemical weapons. The EU is a considerable sponsor of its very functioning and existence. So that's a number of reasons, or not reasons, but it's a number of factors that we could sort of pay attention to when we try to explain why it is that the EU is sponsoring multilateral institutions and how the EU is doing it.
There is also sort of a sub-question to this one when it comes to globalization, because now we see that globalization is sort of in a reduced form. It hasn't disappeared completely, but we have sort of reduced form of globalization. And some people might ask the question, so if the globalization is reduced, does the same apply to multilateralism of the European Union or not?
To some degree, I think there is something to that argument. Because and I know we'll get back to the issue about strategic autonomy later during our talk. But of course, if there are some sectors you take out of globalization, if you, for example, take a strategic decision that you would not like to have a Chinese-owned company to run your D5 network, because then you would be sort of in a risk of that network to be taken out should there be a very serious confrontation between the two units. So in that sense, globalization ad libitum, so to speak, freewheeling globalization, seems to be a thing of the past. And it seems to me that the European Union now has reached a position that for a long time has characterized other major powers, such as the United States or China or Japan or Russia. There is simply parts of the economy that you would not like really to have in the hands of the wrong people, in quotation mark.
Right.
And for that reason, you also see maybe when talking about globalization and the changes, the changing patterns of globalization, that there is maybe a movement towards increased regional centers. Because I think it has been demonstrated by those empiricists who really know their trade patterns, that the volume of internationally exchanged goods is not falling. It continues to go up, but it goes up in a different pattern. And there, as I mentioned before, the issue of strategic autonomy comes into play, and also the concept of nearshoring, where you sort of, as a strategic actor, you make sure that some of the essential goods that you cannot really function well without are being produced at home or nearby. And currently, as I mentioned in the introduction, I'm based in Izmir in Turkey. The business sector here see great promise in nearshoring, because to them it means that European companies take back production from the Far East and situate it near Europe. And basically, from where I sit, I can look just across the Aegean Sea and I can see the European Union. So that is as near as it gets.
Just to conclude the topic about multilateralism of the European Union, do you see that this stage at the moment that we have, which is influenced by many dramatic geopolitical events, does it need a more impulse from a certain higher theory? So, for instance, realism can offer something, neoliberalism can offer something, or constructivism, or because I'm asking, how to sustain that sort of multilateralism and its quality, because many people, they argue with multilateralism, but when it comes to quality, like what was the outcome? How was the quality of the outcome? Then we struggle to define what is the quality of this multilateralism. So this is just my idea. If there is any impulse from a particular higher theory that might improve that stage of multilateralism.
I think the most important input that any theory, IR theory particularly, can offer is a set of very good questions. And I say this because students sometimes tend to believe that theories provide all the answers, but it never does. The theories never do. What they provide is a range of different and more or less relevant questions. And then it's the job of the student or the scholar to find out to which degree those questions are relevant or provide knowledge about a given phenomenon. So I sure believe that it seems to me that the multilateral system is in a severe crisis, because many multilateral organizations, they don't work because states tend to sort of demand more from the multilateral organizations that they're willing to invest. And that is a very unbalanced relationship between demand and supply of investment of political time and other important inputs to the workings of multilateral institutions. Unfortunately, it seems that many of the major multilateral institutions, they are sort of deadlocked. They provide fewer and fewer solutions to all these problems that are piling up. And they are not given sort of the resources it would take to provide solutions that actually could make a difference. So yes, climate change is unfolding. I guess that is a fact for most people. But multilateral action, very limited. You can take the WTO. It is not any longer that global forum for making global trade deals. So if there are trade deals, they tend to be bilateral. If you look at the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and all these institutional undergrowth that you have in that context, the review conferences of the NPT, that is sort of a regular set of conferences, they hardly produce any results because there is too much antagonizing interest among members. So again, there was this old saying that of one of the old foxes in American foreign policy analysis, that we should not ask what the UN can do for us, but what we can use the UN for. Sort of he thereby emphasized the instrumental fashion. And states less and less sort of show an interest in what we can use the United Nations for. Have we seen that many UN resolutions from the Security Council about the war in Ukraine? No, we haven't, because we know that any resolution would be met by a veto by the other side. So we are back in a sense when it comes to the Security Council that very much is similar to the situation during the Cold War, when there was no sort of limit of resolutions, but they were all voted down or vetoed by sort of opposing forces, east or west. So the multilateral system is in a severe crisis, and we should consider which theories can explain why that is the case. And I think that all the main theories have something to offer. Realist theories is basically balance of power theory. And if there's a very strong balance of power dynamics ongoing, then there's for sure one level that suffers, and that is the multilateral level.
The next characteristics of the European Union foreign policy is the whole body called the European External Action Service. And we have lots of discussions about this this body, about functioning. So let's briefly clarify from your perspective as a researcher, how do you understand the role of the European External Action Service in the European Union foreign policy?
There's no lack of complex questions for you, huh?
Therefore, you are my expert today.
Well, I see the EEAS as a kind of arena. And on that arena, there are several encounters that you see. You see different policy paradigms encounter each other, because different member states tend to have different ideas about these policy paradigms, which is sort of the foundational stone for any foreign policy of any consequence. So this is one dimension. That is the often mentioned differences in preferences among member states. But you can also, and that's a second line of encounter different perspectives. You can also sort of look at this encounter pattern as something that is maybe seen as horizontal. I mean, there are different orientations in every country about different political orientations and their preferences for what should be done, what should the EU be, and so on and so forth. So just to put some labels on some of these paradigmatic orientations. There are in Europe, for sure, some politicians and probably also diplomats you could call isolationists. They believe that the European Union should not engage in foreign policy adventures. At least, or instead, we should sort of cultivate our own European garden, use our limited resources to provide welfare, and not engage in the big world, which we cannot change in any case, is sort of the argument. Among some of these isolationists, the European Union itself is too far foreign, is too much an adventure. And when in a given country, those isolationists sort of take charge of government, we get a Brexit. And in other countries, we get sometimes something else. The current government in Italy is for sure also pretty isolationist, although it is surprising how much of business as usual you see coming out of Rome. Other countries have, Norway for a long time believed that the European Union is not for us. We are Norwegians and we should care about Norway, and then use our oil wealth to engage in difficult negotiations like the Israeli-Palestinian or any other very difficult to find a solution for problems. So isolationists come at different levels. Some are nationalists at a very regional level. Take the Basque in Spain, for example, or the Catalans, or take the perpetual problems in Belgium. Belgium is a relatively small country, but it's big enough to have at least two different very opposing ideas about what Belgium is and should be, and how much Belgium should engage in the European Union. So that's the isolationist crowd. Then you have the what I would call and what other people have called the internationalists. Those people who think that it's fantastic to engage in international cooperation because you gain something even if you also give something. That's sort of the axiom of international engagement in cooperation. Then there's a deep split among these internationalists. Some say it's great with cooperation, but we really, really don't like to use force to achieve our foreign policy objectives. So they refrain very much from it. And it means that there is this split between internationalists. Some of them say, yes, we are fully in favor of international cooperation when it's possible. And actually, we don't refrain from the use of force if need be. The other subgroup say definitely not. Not us. We are Europeans. We are peace-loving Europeans, and we will never use force to achieve our objectives. If we cannot achieve our objectives through cooperation, then we just shrug our shoulders and say, oh, that's bad. Let's wait for better times. So that's what is sometimes called the accommodationists. Then, and I have these labels from an old article by Holsti and Rosenau when they analyzed American foreign policy. Of course, they put it into a 2x2 table, and then there's the fourth part missing, and that is what they call the hardliners. Hardliners, according to Rosenau and Holsti, are those politicians who really don't like international cooperation. It's just chit-chat, it's cheap talk, it never comes out of, never produces any result. So yes, we use force because we can. But we kick open foreign doors if they refuse to open the doors themselves. We send the Marines to kick open those doors. So they are really very much in favor of using force and not cooperation. I've looked around in Europe and I don't see that many hardliners of that sort. Maybe in the French strategic culture, there might be some, but it's very, very limited. It's not sort of a tradition or a trend that is very strong in Europe. So in Europe, it's sort of a triangle between the isolationist and the internationalist, divided into two subgroups.
Right.
And that is also what you see actually sort of meeting each other in the EEAS. And it sort of changes over time who has sort of the upper hand, so to speak, who has the ideational power to set the agenda. And I think that might lead to your question about the interest-based and value-based EU foreign policy. Because that is also a topic or an issue that is often addressed, and for good reasons, because it's a real issue, it's a real distinction. Personally, I don't follow the analysis, let's say, that the European Union used to be value-based. And now, increasingly, it is more interest-based.
I just want to explain for the viewers who are not that familiar with what does it mean to have a value-based and interest-based approach. So that comes from the primary sources of the European Union law, and these are the basic agreements, the fundamental agreements that we have. And in these documents, there are values written for the European Union. And this is what we have, or this is why we have a value-based approach. But then there are interests of the European Union, like the European Union wants this or that, so this is an interest. So if we separate the values, we have interest, and we automatically have or logically have the interest-based approach. But there are issues in the foreign policy where the values and interests, they are not always aligned. And this is why the discussion is progressing, so as Professor has already started it.
Yes, very spot on. And I'm happy you mentioned the lawyers, because the European Union that is one of the defining characteristics, that the influence of lawyers is very strong in formulating treaties and deals and understandings of the EU as a foreign policy actor. you can say many positive things about that, but there are also some sort of limits to what lawyers can do. I guess that is the basic reason why Morgenthau, the old classical realist, who were trained as a lawyer, gave up his profession and became an IR scholar, because he realized that law has its limits. And I think the same goes for those lawyers who are employed particularly in the European Commission, but to some degree also in the Council Secretariat. Lawyers are not necessarily very good diplomats. Lawyers know the language of the law, but they don't know that much about sort of the features of international life. So, for example, one of the most absurd formulations that I have come across is when I read that the European strategic relationship with Russia expired in 2007. That a strategic relationship can expire. That is the language of a lawyer who really doesn't know what a strategic relationship is all about, at least as seen from an IR strategic perspective, because then relationships do not expire, but something else happens. And I think this is one of the big challenges of the EEAS, that it's a very, if you look at the staffing, it's a very composite unit. It's basically professionals coming from predominantly the European Commission, to some degree from the Council Secretariat, and then some seconded national diplomats. Not that many, if you sort of look at the big picture. And I think for many years, the reason why the European Commission was not sort of a formidable international player was that they didn't have diplomats employed. They had a few in what was called the DG1A, where they sort of cared about international relations, the way that IR scholars care about international relations. But otherwise, it's sort of the fonctionnaire approach to life. And that takes quite some time to get over. The EES is now, what is it? It's about 15 years. And it has been sort of under construction during a part of this time. So maybe at least they have not sort of disintegrated, which sometimes you see that international companies do when they do a merger. They bring together very different units, very different value sets, and sometimes the merger simply doesn't pay out as it should, according to sort of the best case scenario. It has not happened to the EEAS. So they have adapted. They have probably questioned the behavior of, or some staff members have probably questioned the behavior of other colleagues, but they have sort of worked out a modus operandi. They have been forced to make it work, because without it, well, where would the EES be and where would they be as individuals? So you see a lot of different fault lines meeting in the EES. And for that reason, you can always find evidence that kind of support a given theory, and other evidence that supports a competing theory. And for that reason, it's, in my view, it's a very exciting topic to study. And one forthcoming book that I'm co-editing is exactly looking at how these fault lines in terms of policy paradigms characterize the dynamics of EU foreign policy. So that will be out probably early next year. So it's too late for a Christmas present this year, but next year there's a very good chance that it will be out. It's simply called Europe's World. And it has this double connotation. It's Europe, right? And it's something about Europe itself, the world in Europe. But it's also about how Europe is looking at the worldviews that are cultivated within the European Union. So this is, yes, it's about worldviews, it's about perceptions, it's about all these things that exist on a deeper level than policy. policies are sort of more fluid, they change from time to time, whereas paradigms tend to be more sticky. And it seems to me and also to the majority of the contributors to the book that in terms of the EU's main guiding foreign policy paradigm, nothing has changed for the last 30, 40, 50 years. It's very much a liberal power in its composition. It has liberal preferences. It tries to project liberal values also internationally. The conditions under which the EU is trying to project liberal values have changed dramatically during the last 20 years. If you compare the opening of the European Security Strategy from 2003, it was a fantastic world in which Europe was situated. Never as free, never as promising, never as full of potential. Just 10 years later, the financial crisis has undermined every kind of self-confidence in the European Union, and it was sort of crisis management, that is domestic crisis management. It was almost existential crisis. It was the life of the euro, it was the life of the union, and so on and so forth. So when you are in that situation with yourself, how can you possibly cope with the world? And in the meantime, the world has changed dramatically as well. 2007, Putin saying something in Munich at the Security Conference, which was not promising for a peaceful world. Same thing with President Xi in Beijing. So the world changed dramatically, and to make things worse, I think it was 2012 that two British scholars wrote a very interesting article in which they asked rhetorically, because they came with the answer as well, has Europe's influence in the world peaked? Is it now going downhill? Is the influence in the world actually not as much as it was just 5, 10, 15 years ago? And I think that was a very accurate description of the thing. So when you have an existential crisis at home and your influence abroad is being reduced, is going down, how can you possibly sort of project liberal values to, say, Beijing, where liberal values is of limited interest, at least among the leadership? And you are fully dependent on a continuing trade with China. So, of course, you have to reduce aspirations for changing China in a liberal orientation. Same thing with Russia, where things went from bad to worse. And as people currently guess, we might not yet have seen the worst, even if it looks pretty bad.
Right. And Professor, when we speak about the external action service and the foreign policy of the European Union, there is also the second track of discussion, and that's strategic autonomy. Mm-hmm. And I have two questions for you, because when I was teaching in Scotland, Scottish students, they were asking me, what does it mean, strategic autonomy? Is EU not like autonomous itself, because it's like institutions? So why do we need strategic autonomy? And the second question is, how is this concept formed or shaped by the higher theories? Like, do we have any strong influence, or it's again the competition of the higher theories forming the concept of the strategic autonomy for the European Union?
I think higher theories have something to inform us. We can take a classical realist theory like balance of power theory. Then we would ask ourselves, okay, how is the current polarity in the world? How is the distribution of power? Are we in a situation, well, most people begin by agreeing, it seems that we are no longer in a unipolar situation or moment, which was the case that the world was in 20 years ago. And basically the outcome of the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the alliance system that the Soviet Union built up. So we let out of the equation, there was one superpower left, that was the United States, the unipolar polar moment. Then the big question is if we are now in a condition where it's a multipolarity or possibly bipolarity. Multipolarity, I think, is a chosen language by many authoritarian leaders and dictators who like to be in charge of a part of the world that matters, that has a consequence. And both Russia and China has been very much in favor of a multipolar world. By means they mean a world that is not entirely in the hands of the United States. Now, this talk about multipolarity is sweet music in the ears for various regional great powers, because then they believe that they also make a difference in this pattern of power distribution, which of course they do not. They are regional great powers, and that's fine, but that is not a systemic characteristics where only China, United States really makes a difference. And that is the reason that I question or ask myself if we are going towards multipolarity or bipolarity. Basically, depends on how close Russia and China links up to each other. Because if that relationship gets too close, if China begins or strengthens its support of Russia in its war in Ukraine, then it seems very much like at a systemic level, we have sort of a bipolar situation. Bipolar situation does not necessarily mean that we have a Cold War. It just means that there are two main poles of power, or that the distribution of power ends up at a systemic level at two main superpowers and their allies. Deeper down at regional levels, there is more flexibility. So how does then strategic autonomy fit into this concept of polarity? It seems to me to fit in the sense that the European Union has the potential to create or to constitute itself as one of these power centers, whereby there would then be three. If the strategic autonomy is taken to be, well, it depends then on how the transatlantic relationship is. Is it amicable? Then there are two main centers of power at the systemic level, still US and China. The US is, as always, aligned with Europe. But if transatlantic relations are less amicable, let's say that in 6 months' time, we will have a president that was shot at just a few days ago, a candidate, then it does not necessarily look like that relationship will be amicable. When Trump was last president, he declared the European Union an enemy. And that gave quite some impetus to the whole idea about strategic autonomy. Because if we cannot rely on us Europeans on what used to be our main and only strategic ally, the United States, then what are we? Well, we are on it alone, and we should prepare for that. And that is the aspiration behind strategic autonomy when it comes to security and defense. Then there is the dimension that is you can call it geoeconomic. And then we are back at what we talked about before, about globalization and how globalization tends to become more regionalized. And there has been various interruptions in sort of the global supply lines and value chains and all that. We learned that a few years ago that the supply lines can get disrupted if some stupid captain happened to park his big cargo boat in the middle of the Suez Canal. Big drama, right? Because what was promised to be delivered in week 48 was not delivered before week 52, maybe. And most companies do not really count stock into their operations, but count on deliveries on date. So it's a fragile system. It saves you money, to be sure, but it's fragile. We also learned during COVID times, apparently, according to Tour de France, it's still COVID times, but not the same sort as it was in 2020 and 2021. We also learned that Europe was very dependent on production of these masks, and were dependent on the production of vaccines and much else that was certainly needed. So when we talk about geoeconomic dimension of strategic autonomy, that is what we have in mind. So you have to make a distinction between the security defense sector and the geoeconomic sector. They're both very important, but for different reasons.
Is there any higher theory debate coming from this problem? Like, for instance, among realist constructivist neoliberals? I think scholars must provide some inputs into this debate. Mm-hmm. So how do you see that contemporary debate? Is this debate even existing?
I think I have sad news here, because I don't see sort of a linkage between those IR scholars who tend to think theoretically and those scholars who have an interest in strategic autonomy. So that means that the literature, articles and books about strategic autonomy are predominantly empiricist. And empiricism or empiricist research is very good. We cannot be without it. But when it sort of degenerates into empiricism, where you sort of have a hate-love relationship to theoretical reflection, then it becomes not guided by theory. Then it becomes pretty sort of accidental what kind of information you take in for your consideration. And I think that there is this estranged behavior between, or relationship between the theoretical thinking world of IR scholars and those who actually care about strategic autonomy. So for those who might watch this, there is a good task that awaits some serious attention.
Absolutely. And also, when I was writing my article that I submitted last month, I also discovered that when you read the legal scholars or texts coming from the legal scholars, their articulation is very limited because they must articulate within the legal text. So, the theorizing is possible, but to have a good paper submitted in some good legal journal, they usually stick with the legal text because this might, create some sort of legal movement for the decision of the judge or the lawyers or that. So this is also some of the limitation I can see, that I personally miss more legal scholars who are able to theorize without being, attached to the legal texts that are currently in the European Union. So that's sort of my remark to your words.
2 years at the European University Institute in Florence, I had the opportunity to sit in at some of the lectures and workshops that were conducted by some of the legal scholars who were at the EUI at the same time. And I really, really enjoyed very much sitting in and listening and trying to understand the legal reasoning. And I think it was easier done compared to many other workshops in other settings where people are sort of legal. At least the EUI legal scholars tend to be those who have an interest in law in context. And that context can be very different things. It can be sociology. It can be strategic studies. It can be organizational studies. But what they do is to mix the legal perspective with some other perspectives. So basically what they do is to engage in multidisciplinary research when it's best.
Right.
But I don't know if the law in context Florence School have also been active in the field of studies on strategic autonomy.
Right. The last section of the interview is what we have is international negotiations of the European External Action Service and how this impacts the European Union foreign policy. So how would you evaluate this topic? What sort of discussions can you see? And is there any good evidence or we have some sort of experience that a particular IO theory influenced the outcome of those negotiations?
It was maybe one of the. It is maybe one of your hardest questions. It's because I'm searching the registers in my mind and in my reference lists, and I don't come up with some very, very good combinations where a given IR theory explain negotiations or, for that matter, diplomacy. Diplomacy studies also tend to be predominantly empiricist or legal. And the same goes for negotiation. And those approaches that exist, for example, double-edged diplomacy with the two levels of negotiators, they haven't really paid too much attention to how negotiations is ongoing inside the European Union, inside the EEAS, and also some of the committees, which is kind of the engine room of European diplomacy. And they have also not been employed, to the best of my knowledge, in studies of how the EU engages in international negotiations. There are some features that tend to be observed time and again. And one of these features is that the European Union tend to be sort of a very difficult negotiator to deal with, because the European diplomats, they spend a lot of time trying to make a deal internally. And given different preferences and levels of decision-making powers, both diplomatically, politically, country-wise, it takes a long time to sort of come up with an understanding of the EU's position. Then eventually it happens, and it happens from time to time, and the EU got a position. Then they can begin to engage in international negotiations. But they cannot engage in give and take, because every give will say that will imply that they break up their internal deal, and then they're back to where they started. So they tend to say it's this or nothing, and for that reason, the EU is sometimes, quite often, sort of asked to play with themselves in a corner, where the rest of the negotiators actually try to flesh out some kind of deal. And then when a deal is approaching, the European Union is invited, and they come up with then sometimes a fait accompli. Are you with us or not? It's your choice. So that is one way in which the European Union is characterized as a negotiator. Fortunately, there are also some sort of better cases where, for example, it is pointed out that the European Union has this long and winding road to get to a deal internally. Then they flesh out a deal, and because of these different preferences are being taken into consideration, sometimes the international negotiators can then say, actually, we understand that none of you European countries got all you wanted. You fleshed out a compromise. Let's elevate it up to the international level. Let's make it sort of the point of departure for a little bit more of negotiation, but basically the basic structures of a deal is what you brought. This is sometimes the case when it comes to NPT negotiations, where European Union member states include some who have nuclear arms and some most of them who don't. So already there is a compromise necessary. Both parties need to see themselves reflected in a given compromise text. That can be elevated up to the international level, except that so many other factors then come into play, that those solutions often are no-goes at the international level. And for that reason, the NPT review conferences have been deadlocked for the last 10 years, and there was a little bit of a sort of a renaissance of these conferences and the output. But if you go back to the 80s, 90s, it was about the same. It's deadlocked because those who have strong difficulties giving up their nuclear arms. And I think quite a few Ukrainians can tell them why they should be. Because if Ukraine had not done that back in the 90s, the theoretical argument is that then we would not have a war right now. But you ask about negotiations and diplomacy, and how that is how that is explained by theories and the questions that theories can ask about processes of negotiation. And again, I don't see that much out there.
The last question, Professor, for today's interview. And this is quite interesting for researchers and junior researchers, because when we research the European Union foreign policy, we sometimes face sort of generalizations. You propose federalizations of the European Union in terms of foreign policy, or what do you propose? And this puts the researcher into sort of position when, he's thinking or she is thinking about but should I support federalization or not? And this then influences the final paper which is written. So my question is, how do you address those challenges as a researcher, that you have sort of hard debates, you have polarization, you have generalization, but you still must produce something which is based on evidence, based on your thinking or the empiricism. So how to approach this?
Well, if I prefer a federalization of the formation of EU foreign policy or not, that is basically a political question. And I have never had any political aspirations in my life. I have been very comfortable being in the observer role and the analyst role. So I look at what is ongoing, what it seems to me to be ongoing, and whether that is good or bad, I leave for those people who read my publications. But I can also say that the second possible answer is to say, okay, I could be in favor of federalization of EU foreign policy, but that will have no consequence whatsoever, because there is no political dominant preference for such a change. It's a dead herring, and it has been a dead herring for many years, if not always. Of course, some of the classical European federalists had that idea, or they had that dream or aspiration, and that was something that motivated their analytical engagement. And they had this teleological view or perspective on things, that what they did now in terms of analysis should be something that would lead to that telos, to the end goal of the process. But I think for scholars, it's much more important that we, and maybe that is particularly relevant for European scholars, that we give up this preference that we tend to have for specificities. All sorts of empirical details are allowed to play a role. So I think we could do much better if we began to think more theoretically. Because what is it that theories do? Well, they simplify as much as they can. So they elevate from a very complex world where everything is connected to everything else and in different layers and multi-perspectives, to something that we can comprehend. Then, of course, a lot of detail is missed during that translation from the world as it is, complex as it is, and up to that more theoretical perspective. But that is the function that theories have. And one successful example of this taking the chopper up to a perspective is Barry Poson's analysis of European defense policy, where he does acknowledge, or he cannot resist pointing to us European scholars and our preference for making all details matter. So he commented on that, and then he displays in a short article some of the dynamics that explain the dynamics of EU foreign policy, and with a particular idea or perspective to defense policy. And basically what he explains is that the European Union's defense policy is and was an attempt to balance US defense. Of course, you cannot balance too harsh because you are balancing your strategic ally. But to all insightful observers, this situation, which we had for 20 years or maybe 15 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union with unipolarity, it was not foreseen. No theoretical perspective foresaw such a situation, and most theorists saw it as not lasting. So he says, it was the European Union's attempt to balance the United States. That is basically what it was all about, in a theoretical perspective, where it's balance of power that has key explanatory function or utility. Constructivists would also elevate up and say, well, it was in the interest of the European politicians to strengthen European defense. And why was it? Well, because the European politicians saw it as the European identity to have a certain set of interests. We could not continue to rely on the backing of our strategic ally. It was time to take charge of our own security. As Tony Blair famously put it back in the 1990s, it's time to pay back. Meaning, in his perspective, that during the entire Cold War, Europe was the junior partner to the United States. They provided our security. But now, again, in his argument, now the European Union or Europe is strong economically. It is regaining its strength. So it's time to take our own security, to take charge of our own security. And basically that is what he said in the 90s. Our previous discussion about our talk about strategic autonomy is basically the same argument. We cannot possibly rely on anybody in the world, in the new world, and how that is composed. So if you are, so goes the argument, if you are a responsible politician, then you have to support strategic autonomy. And we can then discuss politically how we best achieve that.
Yes, and I would like to add one thing to what Professor Jørgensen said, and that's the uniqueness of the research. I think this is quite important when you're trying to write about the European Union foreign policy. But I think, the uniqueness of the research is the answer that we should address today, because we need more research about this topic. It's so complex. There are so many, implications. There are so many constraints that we have to overcome. And I think theorizing, reading the books written by people like Professor Jørgensen, when you can widen your perspectives and you can see the world quite differently. And that's the important message that I think we should address today for researchers, for the audience that are interested in European Union foreign policy.
Well, I'm all in favor of a pluralist outlook. I think it's actually our responsibility to preserve what is left of pluralists' outlook. And it seems to me that the worst a young scholar can do is to marry himself or herself with a certain theoretical perspective. Maybe that happens when the person is 20 years old, and then that perspective stays with the person until they retire, and basically until sort of the end of their life. And I don't really get the fun of it, and I don't see it as very fruitful. I know that some make a theoretical perspective or orientation almost like a personal identity issue. And they get upset if you sort of point out that there are other perspectives as well. So personally, for those who have not browsed my publications, I can reveal that when I wrote my PhD thesis, I took a neorealist, a reformulated neorealist perspective as it was represented at the time by Barry Busan and others. But I have also, during my various studies of EU foreign policy, I've also really enjoyed pursuing an English school perspective. And of course, as it happens, Barry Busan gave up his neorealist credentials at some point and became a representative of the English school. I have also, and that was particularly in the 1990s, I pursued this social constructivist perspective, and I was very much inspired by John Rodney and Fritz Tocqueville and their work on international regimes and cooperation and that kind of stuff. And it seems to me that yes, these social features, there are so many also in the European Union, that a constructivist perspective makes a lot of sense. And most recently, I've pursued the liberal theoretical orientation in a number of different publications, both for teaching and research purposes. I published this book about how liberal perspectives have developed in Europe. European theoretical inclined people cultivating the liberal tradition of theorizing IR. And in terms of teaching, I have contributed a chapter to the Oxford University Press volume, a textbook that is being used by so many different universities. So I couldn't decline the invitation to contribute that chapter on the liberal perspective. It doesn't mean that I once was a neorealist, then I became an English school guy, and then a social constructivist, and finally a liberal. Not at all. It's not sort of a sequence of different perspectives. It's a choice you make as a scholar when you look at a certain topic and say, okay, what do I really want to know from this topic? If I want to know something about the current balance of power theory, balance of power in the world, and there seems to be a lot of relevance to this kind of knowledge, well, then for sure I would look into various realist perspectives. But the world is also full of institutions, and both constructivist and liberal scholars are very good at explaining dynamics of institutions. Sometimes there's even an overlap, because what is NATO? Yes, it's an institution seen from a liberal perspective. It's an alliance seen from a realist perspective. So the subject matter is one and the same, but different perspectives give something that you would not get without the other.
That's correct.
Basically, it's a choice.
That's correct, Professor. And I think, this is the time to finish this discussion, this fruitful discussion. I'm very thankful for you for being on IO Thinker. Thank you for insightful thoughts and remarks. And I'm looking for next publications coming from you, and share it with my students and also the viewers of my channel.